Good afternoon. We're going to get started. I just want to welcome everyone to the high school. Thank you guys for coming. We're super excited to have Sean Smith from Modern Teacher here today to really talk about the work that we've been doing over the past 2 years, and especially the work that we've been doing around competency-based learning. I just want to take a couple of minutes to revisit the definition that we've all been really grounded in around competency-based learning. And I want to thank all of the teachers and teacher leaders and our principals who have been a part of the work that we've been doing, building those competencies within its learning, and really just going out there on a limb to do this work, because I know it's challenging work, but it's good work and it's a great journey that we've all been on. So again, especially to that fourth grade team where's the fourth grade teachers? Wave your hands around here. They deserve a big round of applause. They have taken on quite a challenge and have just done some remarkable work. So again, I want to thank you for that. But before we bring Sean up onto the stage, I want to make sure we review our definition of competency-based learning. And I think that key piece to take away is that we're really building a system, a K-12 system of instruction, assessment, grading, academic reporting, the curriculum, that whole system, and that takes a lot of time and a lot of work, and we're doing a great job. But again, it is a journey, and it's going to take time. And the second piece I want to just make sure we are all focused on is that we're looking at competency with proficiency. We want to hold our students accountable to some very specific things that we all agree upon that are important and are based upon our standards, 21st century skills, and really what's best for our students. And that's what we're trying to do here in Fraser, and we're doing a great job with that. So I'm very excited that Sean is here today to talk with us and kind of, I really believe, pull things together and hopefully give you a little bit of a bigger perspective on where we're headed. And let's give him a warm Fraser welcome. And take it away, Sean.
Thank you. It is really good to be back in Fraser Public Schools. I've said this time and time again. You continue to push my thinking around this work, and I'm really happy to be here today to kind of share some of the things that we've been working on over the last 12 months since I saw you last, I think at the beginning of the school year in August. So today, here's what I want to do. Many of you have seen our work around Teacher as Architect, which is this idea of how do we take instructional design and instructional delivery and begin to take all of the isolated parts of planning and teaching and put them together into a coherent whole. And our work today is going to focus on thinking about what that means at the lesson level, and how do we take all of the pieces from Teacher as Architect and begin to put them together, and what does that look like when it's played out into a school system and eventually, ultimately, at the classroom level. Richard Elmore is one of my favorite authors, and he's done a lot of work at Harvard around this idea of district systemic reform. And one of the things he says is that if it's not in the instructional core, it's not there. And he defines the instructional core, and there were a few folks before him that defined this, as this idea where the teacher and the student come together in the presence of content. And it's this idea that when that happens, we look at the task that kids are doing, and the task ultimately predicts performance. In other words, there's a direct correlation to rigor around this work. And so it had me thinking over the last year, because I've done a lot of work with districts and teachers around this idea of the teacher, the content, and the student, and how we build relationships around that to affect change in the classroom. But it had me thinking, is that any different today when we begin to design blended experiences for kids? And what happens when the teacher and the students come together in the presence of a virtual space or the presence of the classroom? And how do we begin to think about that? And so it had me thinking that I think over the next 5 to 10 years, as we wrestle as a system and as educators, as a profession, around this idea of this instructional core, we have to begin to be thinking about this context, that today you are modern teachers. You have gone through this journey, and you're beginning to change and redesign the instruction in your classroom. And our kids are digital natives, and we know that, and they're coming to us with, I think, a different lens on the world, especially the kids that our kindergarten and first grade are born into this touchscreen generation. And so when we think about that, how do we then begin to think about digital content and creating blended experiences in this instructional core? And that's going to be at the heart of what we talk about today, which is how do we take at the lesson level a foundation to think about, the last time I was here, we talked about disruptive innovation at the classroom level, and we talked about students owning the choice over time, place, path, and pace. Now think about those concepts again: time, place, path, pace. And to do that, we've got to redesign some things, systemically as a district and at the classroom level as a teacher. And so today I want to walk you through a lesson, but I want to reimagine time and pace, and I want to ground it in what I think all lessons should be built around, which is the idea of how do we learn best. And we call that a learner profile. And so I call this now a lesson block, because I've stopped thinking about lessons as 45-minute chunks or 30-minute chunks or even 90-minute chunks. And I know in the past some of us have taken lessons and carried them on from a day or two, or maybe even 3. But I'm starting to think about lesson blocks as opening up content and curricula for kids, and both facilitating and teaching through that process. But what happens when I start to open up curricula and design it around a learner profile? Well, I want to make sure that we secure our common language. I know in Fraser you've done a lot of work around building a common language. And so when I think about the term learner profile, I use Tomlinson's definition from '03, and I think about this idea that it's a broad term used to combine several overlapping concepts related to the learner. In other words, what are the characteristics that neuroscience says matter in learning? And then how are they different in each of us? Well, when I think about learning styles, my colleague and I talk about the idea that I always go, when I build something or I write something or I create something, I go from part and then I figure out the whole. And she goes from the whole and needs that first, or she can't start talking about the parts. And it's a constant like this for us, but our brains are wired to process that differently. There's a host of things that go into learning styles and intelligence preferences and interests and academic readiness factors and the influences of culture and gender on the learning process. Today, we're going to get granular at the lesson level, and I'm going to show you how I built a lesson around the first 4 components of a student's learner profile and get your reaction to it. And so it starts with going back to the idea that when we design instruction, we have to be very intentional in our pedagogical choice. Now, a lot of educators have talked about the idea of pedagogy in a broad term as the process of teaching, right? For us, when we started to think about that, while pedagogy is teaching, it was too broad. And I wanted to get a little more specific because I wanted to know the nuances that made the difference between different approaches. And so when we defined that in Teacher as Architect, we talked about the idea that the specific steps or the elements of the lesson and the specific order of those elements used to build or scaffold learning for students. So it matters if I choose to model the learning task at the beginning of the lesson, or if I model the learning task after students have done the thinking at the end of the lesson. In one approach, we look at Madeline Hunter's Mastery Teaching, 1982, direct instruction. I do, we do, you do, check for understanding, closure, and summary. And in the other one, we may open with a more conceptual question and build a constructivist point of view or an inquiry-based model of learning or a pedagogy. The literature is really clear on pedagogy. There is no bad pedagogy. I think over time, direct instruction has kind of become somewhat of a little dirty word in education because we get worried about the teacher on the stage lecturing. And the literature actually says that there's a moment where we need to do direct instruction. And it's really clear on when we should be doing that. So when I look at units of study, I actually want to see a myriad of pedagogical offerings. I want to see constructivism in the unit. I want to see opportunities for kids to be inquiring and investigating their way through big ideas and essential questions. But I also know that there's a moment where a teacher needs to pull a small group of kids and really intervene and do some direct modeling and have some guided practice right there with coaching and feedback to help kids secure the learning. So in this, I'm going to walk you through a lesson in which the lesson starts with whole group intentional direct instruction. But as the lesson goes on, I don't think about this over a 45-minute or a day chunk. I'm going to open this up to say over 2 weeks, I'm going to go through a multitude of lessons, and that's why I call it a block, and I'm going to change the pedagogical approach throughout that. So in this particular case, what I want to do is I want to walk you into a 4th grade teacher's classroom. And in this classroom, they are in the process of going through a traditional novel study, like they've done before, year after year. And in this particular case, they're reading the Tale of Despereaux. And the teacher here has chunked content into chapters. And so what I want to do is I want to give you a glimpse into the lesson block over a 2-week period in chapters 12 and 13. And the focus of this is to help kids understand the process of narrative writing, which is a Common Core standard for 4th grade, as well as being able to use context clues to derive word meaning as they're reading through the novel. And so in this particular case, you can see up here that I'm going to start building in my digital platform a focus question. This platform looks a little bit different from yours. You use It's Learning. I just built this in a separate platform. Don't think features and functions right now, just think conceptual design. Everything I'm showing you, we can build this inside It's Learning, okay? So in this particular case, I'm going to start the week's instruction, and I'm going to start by asking kids to think about a couple of things. What do you do when you don't know or understand the meaning of a word? And then how does the dialogue make reading a story exciting or interesting to the reader? Now, these are not my unit essential questions, because unit essential questions are designed to provide academic discourse. They're bigger concepts. They're designed to provoke debate in a class, and they tend to not have a right or wrong answer. These are my lesson essential questions. I'm in the lesson block here, and we're going to do this over the course of the next 2 weeks. You'll see, though, because I've built some blended experiences for kids, I'm going to unlock curriculum for them to give them more choice in the learning process. I'm going to start whole group, and I'm going to pose this question to the kids. Even though they have devices in their hands, I don't want them doing this yet individually, because there's a couple of things that we don't want to throw out the window. I don't want to walk into class and have kids be robots on a digital platform, never interacting with each other or myself. I need to build a learning community. So there are moments in time where I want to bring kids together whole group, and I'm going to start the lesson off with asking the kids this. And ultimately, they're going to get into their device and they're going to have some options down the road. But I want to have some thoughtful conversation to build my culture and my community in my classroom. So if you look here, I start with a very specific focus question. The next thing I need to do is I know that when I'm looking at context clues and writing a narrative, I need to connect with what kids already know. I need to activate their prior knowledge. And I know that looking at the 3rd grade standards in the Common Core, they've done some work around this. So I'm going to continue to build some digital content, and I'm going to click on Activate Prior Knowledge. And in this particular case, I want to know what kids know about using context clues and what context clues are. So I've built a PowerPoint, a digital asset in this case, that kids can click through, and it teaches them some background knowledge around context clues. Because we're going to use this when we get into the actual learning tasks that I want kids to know and be able to do. So I've now begun the class together. Kids have devices. They're able to access some digital content. And I framed the learning for them by creating a focus question. And I've begun to look at how do we use context clues, or what do we know about context clues. You can go ahead and go back to the next piece there, Jeff. So far, everything that I've done is pretty traditional. There hasn't really been much that I necessarily needed the technology to do. Although the digital assets are nice, I could have done this whole group with a chalkboard or a smartboard or some tablets. But here's where I'm going to begin to change what happens. And so when we look at this build, I'm going to design a learning task, and I'm going to connect it to learner profiles. And so how do I do that? I first start by understanding what we call academic readiness. And if you go back to our definition here, I'm going to hit on academic readiness first. And so I think the most profound work around academic readiness comes from Vygotsky. And Vygotsky says that we need to have instruction in the sweet spot, right, which is that zone of proximal development. In other words, the zone of proximal development, ZPD, is a bridge. And it says, what does the learner currently know? What do we want them to know? And that middle part between what they know and what we want them to know is where instruction should happen. But there's a critical factor there. What do they currently know so that I can scaffold or build learning? But what often happens in the classrooms is that what kids currently know, if you've got a set of 30 kids, is all over the board, right? You know that. I see you grinning out there. You live this every day. And so how do we begin to think about solving for academic readiness in this kind of world? So as we begin to do this, what I'm going to do is talk to you a little bit about Marzano's work, which is called proficiency scales. And Marzano talks about this as, I think some of the terms you might have used here is Marzano scales, but we call them proficiency scales. And here's how this works. This is maybe going to be a new concept for you. So proficiency scales are scales that help students demonstrate what they have learned, the knowledge and skills that they are expected to learn as they progress through their education. It's the foundation of competency-based learning. Academic readiness refers to what I just talked about, the distance between what a learner knows and what we want them to know. So I'm going to bring these two concepts together in curriculum design. How do I do that at the lesson level? Well, I start by saying, what's the learning task that I want kids to learn? So I take my Common Core standard, and for this case, let's use context clues. And I've got the standard, and I've designed a grade level learning task that I want all kids to know and be able to do as a result of going through this activity, right? I've got some instructional strategies. Kids are going to be engaged in this lesson, and I want kids to be able to demonstrate Common Core grade level mastery at the end of this. The problem with that approach is that not every kid has the background knowledge or is ready for that ZPD zone, right? And so in this particular case, I'm going to use proficiency scales, and I'm going to break down that standard, and I'm going to design that learning task at a level 3, a Common Core standard. But I'm also going to do two other things. I'm going to design it one step lower, and so if what kids know is right here, and what we want them to know is here, and here's where the instruction is, I'm going to design a task if kids know here, and there's a gap in their learning. And so now what I've done is I've moved that sweet spot of what the instruction should be, and I probably aided it with a handful of strategies like graphic organizers and some additional media that may help me in the learning process, or just move the task down. And I'm going to do that again as well, down to a level 1 in proficiency. And so when I do that, I've actually built 3 digital lessons for this standard that I can begin to use to determine where kids are for their readiness factors in the instruction. So what does that look like in my platform? Well, if you go over here, I first need to frame the learning. So I click on task 1, and all kids will get this. So they will see that in this activity, I'm going to have kids make predictions about what's going to happen next, and I want them to write the next chain of events using predictions, including the dialogue and sensory words to enrich their experience. If I click back out of that, what kids don't know in this particular case, and you can do this in It's Learning, is that I've got 3 different tasks that all say the same thing, all related to context clues, but I've got a level 3 for some kids, a level 2 for some kids, and a level 1 for some kids, and up on their dashboard in the platform, they're only going to see what I've assigned them. So in other words, they look a little bit different. I'm asking them to do some things that are a little bit different because I'm scaffolding the learning. So if I click on P1 here, Proficiency Scale 1, one of the things that you will see here is asking kids to fill out this graphic organizer, and it's around context clues. The other component that we believe that has become so important is as you build digital curriculum and your district begins to build digital curriculum and push that out to teachers and you can customize it and use it how you want in your classroom, kids need that relationship piece, even in the virtual space, to see and hear their own teacher. So you will see that in this particular video clip, the teacher here in 4th grade is explaining what to do in this particular graphic organizer to the kids. They want to see this. Now, we don't have the sound hooked up to this. Go ahead and hit play, Jeff. I don't think you're actually going to hear the sound. What you hear is this teacher talking to her kids about this particular task, and that becomes a pretty critical component. You'll also hear, one of the things that we teach about as teachers create digital content is the ability for you to be informal in that process. Kids need to hear that it's not just you're on stage and doing this. They actually want to have you talk to them like it's a conversation. So you'll hear this particular teacher at home saying, my dog's in the background, I need to go get a cup of coffee, and the kids actually feel more connected to the digital space because of that. Now these lessons, as Jeff scrolls up or down, you will see that I'm using some of the things that you've used. LearnZillion's in here, and I've built digital assets in this particular case around writing dialogue and using context clues in this. And so as I scaffold the learning, I'm putting different things in here for kids to use at different scales. What we often find in this, as we build proficiency scales and curriculum aligned to this, is that you will need some type of check or a formative assessment at the beginning of the unit, because one of the questions we get is, how do you determine who's in the scale? Do you put kids in a 3, 2, or 1? And you need some pretty good quantitative data to be able to do that. What you don't want to do is just take a whim and say, well, Johnny needs to go here because he's, a slower learner, he's learning slow on some of this stuff. You actually need the data to be able to do this. The system, your platform, will allow you to build in some formative assessments along the way and pre-populate and put kids in scales down the road after some of this curriculum is built. When this happens, using our language, we call this customized learning. And so you will see, Jeff, if Jeff goes back out here in a second, you will see that task 1 has 3 different options, and kids are assigned in this. And task 2, which is writing a narrative, does the same thing, has 3 different choices. And so in this particular 2-week lesson block, I have kids zeroing in on a focus question, activating whole group prior knowledge, and then within tasks, I am differentiating based on one component of a learner profile at this point in time, which is academic readiness. And we call that customized learning. If you remember our definitions back from when you went through the cohorts of training, customized learning is teacher-adjusted instruction based on data. I'm going to continue to build this out, but we're actually going to make this more of an interactive session here. So what I want you to do is take a look at what I've presented up here. And I want you to talk to the people sitting next to you. What's your reaction to this? In some ways, it's probably validating, because my sense is, forget the technology and forget the digital lessons. You're probably doing this in a lot of centers, and you're doing this naturally. What we want to start to talk about is, what's that vision going forward of how this could actually be redesigned in a lot of different ways? Talk to the person sitting next to you. You've got about 3 to 5 minutes to do that now. React to this. Okay, finish your thoughts. 4, 3, thank you. So this is in the future and down the road. We have to remember that this is a journey and Rome wasn't built in a day. But when you start to look at this and you design digital lessons, or your district pushes out digital content and lessons around proficiency scales, a couple of words of caution. Number one, the desire here is that we're building a competency-based system and that kids progress around mastery. So it is not okay for a kid to be at a level 1 and complete the task and stay there. The idea behind this is when the formative assessment says that the child has mastered the concepts in a level 1 proficiency, that they need to move up and do the level 2 proficiency and eventually work their way up to grade level mastery. Now, in this particular case, because of the current structures that I'm working in my classroom with the amount of time that I have, I'm opening up the pacing over 2 weeks because kids can begin to work through these tasks over a 2-week period. Down the road, structures in schools may be changed. Maybe your bell schedules and the way you design, how kids go from content to content or grade to grade may change. But right now, we have to work within the structures that we have. The other component is, over time, I may, as I build my repertoire of digital lessons, I may build 2 or 3 or 4 different lessons in a proficiency scale. And so if a child is assigned to a level 2 proficiency scale at the beginning of the unit, and there's 5 lessons in there, they can pick which lesson they want to do to demonstrate mastery to move on. And that's where more student choice comes into play as well. But I'm not done here. So as I begin to think about these tasks, we know that in some cases, the Common Core just isn't enough. In some cases, the Common Core doesn't address the fundamental P21 skills or Fluency 21 skills that we want kids to know and be able to do. In some cases, it does, but not every standard. And so how do we begin to incorporate authentic tasks, the performance of authentic real-world relevance into our lessons? And that begins with this idea that we want to align more choice around 2 fundamental concepts of a learner profile. The first is intelligence preferences. And Gardner did some great work on this, and I think this is critical, and it's different than interest. Intelligence preferences are hardwired neurological preferences for thinking and learning that can be categorized into 8 categories. And so how do we help design curricula around those neurologically hardwired components as well as the interests of kids? Because we know that motivation factors are directly tied to interest, and interest is directly tied to an emotional connection to content. And that's where we go back to this instructional core. It's the teacher that facilitates the relationship between the student and the content, and the teacher and the student. And if kids don't have the why am I learning this, or how can I use this in the real world, it becomes problematic, and it's directly linked to motivation factors and ultimately interests. So in this particular case, I'm going to build a performance task in this lesson block, and I'm going to push past a grade level 3 proficiency scale, and I'm going to say, you know what, this task, it's going to include 21st century skills. It's going to have the fundamental pieces of a concept-based curriculum and not just a content or skills-based curriculum. And I'm going to design that in a performance task, real-world relevance, and I'm going to give kids choice around their interests and their intelligence preferences. And so when I do that, in this particular case, I give kids the choice over this 2 weeks to be a cartoonist, a screenwriter, or an animator. And that plays out digitally over here. And so we start by clicking on the performance task. And in this case, it's time to combine the skills that you've learned through narrative writing and dialogue and show off your understanding. For this assignment, you choose to be a cartoonist, a screenwriter, or a narrator, or an animator. And if you scroll down, I've got some content around each of these pieces. Now, these are directly linked to intelligence preferences and the interests of students because they get the choice. And when kids choose We call this personalized learning. And remember the difference between personalized and customized, back to our definitions up here. Teacher-adjusted instruction is the customization. Student choice in the learning process is the personalization, and we need both in the unit. And so when we're looking at these tasks, Jeff, if you'll click back out. Let's click in the cartoonist. And so in this particular case, I've put a Google Doc in as a comic strip. Let's go ahead and click on that. And I'm asking kids to be a cartoonist and narrate and draw the chain of events in the novel study that we're reading. And so here is a Web 2.0, Web 3.0 tool. I've also included a video to help them understand more about the Google Drive in the classroom and the Google applications, as well as some of the comic strips that we've been using. So I've got some digital media to teach this particular part of the task. You go ahead and go back out. Let's go ahead and click on the animator or the screenwriter. Here, they're going to write a screenplay. And in this particular case, we're looking at dialogue, and we're looking at the skills included for the linguistic kids that are really interested in writing on this. Ultimately, we will have groups of kids act this out in the classroom as well. But again, it goes back to the novel study, and it's focusing on character development in the novel. Go ahead and go back. Let's look at an animator. In this particular case, I'm giving them a canvas here so kids can draw and show your sketches on this. And then I've got some more examples of real-world application of animation and some careers that are tied to animation as well. These incorporate the 21st century skills and ask kids to use the knowledge of the Common Core standards, context clues, and writing a narrative, and to put it into a different context. And in this particular case then, around these performance tasks, I have now asked kids over a 2-week period of time to be able to complete the tasks aligned to Vygotsky's zone of proximal development and given them choices in the actual authentic real-world task. So I want to stop here. I'm going to give you some time to process, and then I'm going to come down to the floor here, and we're going to pass around the mic and give you an opportunity to ask some questions or make some comments before I build some of these other pieces of this lesson design, okay? Turn and talk with your neighbor now. How are you reacting to this? Jess, are you back there? Do you have the mic, the handheld mic? When we're ready, we'll just need to have somebody run that.
There's no one over there, Jess.
Okay, 3. Go ahead and finish your thoughts. 2. Great. Carrie and Jess are going to help me pass around the mics. Anybody have a question or a comment about so far what I presented, or just something that'll help add to the dialogue? Yes, we'll bring the mic. Jared's going to ask a question for us.
Hi, everybody. Question, I was wondering is this linear? Do you do task 1, then task 2, and then the performance test? One thing I've noticed is students are always wanting to just get it done quick.
Yeah.
Do we use the adaptive release, or are they just going to try to get that performance task done?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I think a couple of things. I don't think it should be designed linear. I actually think it should be opened up, and we teach kids time management and the ability to navigate back and forth between tasks. Now, it scares a lot of us to say, you got to complete task 1, got to complete task 2 before you can do the performance task. And ultimately, kids want to do the performance task, right? Because it's more fun, it's more engaging. And that's maybe what we should be thinking about in terms of the learning experience. Having said that, what I would say is the performance tasks have to have the academic rigor. So there's more to this that I'm not going to go into, but it's not just drawing a cartoon. There was a lot of layered pieces that they What we don't want is, for our most struggling kids, more work. And the time to actually move all the way up through each of these things, I think, would be laborious and very difficult. You have to build a system in where it's at the right instructional level, but it's not based on completion of work. It's based on when they get the concept, they can move to the next thing. And the theory behind this is that if you put kids at a level 3 and they don't have the background knowledge or the skill set to even do half of that stuff, you end up reteaching the stuff that they don't know anyway, and it holds up the rest of the class or the group. So you have to be able to use some teacher direct instruction where they pull a small group of kids working at a level 1 for 10 minutes in the class and try to do some work. Other teachers that may be supporting kids with IEPs or whatever it may be, and hopefully solid digital media that can help some of the learning process as well. But in theory, it's designed to, yes, make kids target instruction where they're ready for. You have a follow-up to that?
And the poor kid is always in level 1.
Yeah, right. I mean, that's the piece of this. So think about the converse to that. So the poor kid that's in level 1 is now actually getting instruction targeted to where they're ready for. The poor kid that should be in a level 1 that's working at a level 3 tends to be frustrated and have low self-esteem and efficacy for the work that's being done because they're constantly getting failing grades and they're struggling to keep up with the class. While conversely, oftentimes peers or teachers will also have a hard time differentiating for kids because the rest of the class is ready to move on. So it's no perfect answer, but ultimately over time, Vygotsky would say that learning takes place in your sweet spot, the bridge between what you know and what you don't know, and that's where it is. And if we put kids where what they know, and over here is where you're trying to get them without building that bridge to that, the converse of it isn't any better. I would actually say it's more harmful. It's a great question. I appreciate the question. Yep.
How do you see this looking in a physical space? So if we're talking about the blended environment, we see how it looks online. In the secondary classroom, like I know in elementary there's many stations that are involved.
Right.
What does the physical environment look like with this?
Yeah, it's a really great question. And so we're going to get to that component. And one of the ways that I think is an easy place to begin is with learning styles and the physical environment. And so you will see when we go back to the definition of learning styles, a lot of learning styles is catered around the environment. Noisy or quiet. Like, think about your learning preferences, right? Do you like to stand up or sit down? Do you want a noisy classroom or quiet classroom? Cold or warm? Dark or light? These are all a preferred contextual approach to a way that your brain is going to move information from short-term memory to working memory to long-term memory. And we're all different with that, right? And so I think one of those places begins with the physical learning environment of attacking learning styles. At the elementary level, and I'm going to editorialize now, so this often makes people a little angry, but I'll just say that. At the elementary level, teachers tend to gravitate towards the environment because they have to keep a 7-year-old's attention, right? You're not going to put 7-year-olds in rows for 7 hours, and they tend to have them longer than in a period of time. So it is an easier leap for most elementary teachers to design the physical environment that starts to look at a lot of kids doing a lot of different things, not in rows with bean bags and standing up, sitting down, moving around. It is a harder shift at the high school for some teachers, not all, because the environment isn't necessarily catered to that. And the kids are bigger and the spaces it's harder in the physical space. But I think there's a lot of room for work around the physical environment in our high school classrooms. And so I would start by thinking about the redesign of the physical space in a high school classroom. Now, I know that comes with management issues, and it comes with teaching kids how to be able to, because I said this earlier today when we were talking to some of your principals, our kids, for the most part, are really good at playing school. They know what to do. They know how to come to class, sit in rows, listen to work, or listen to the teacher and turn in work. They're good at those ground rules. You're talking about when you redesign the physical space, providing new ground rules. And I will tell you that I have a colleague who started a school in Chicago 2-3 years ago, and they were pulling their hair out at the high school level when they tried to redesign the learning environment for kids at the high school level. And they opened the school, but kids didn't know how to behave in it. They didn't know how to act in it. I mean, it was a real issue. And they had to struggle through that, and they had to teach these things. But I do think we have to redesign the physical space at the high school level to give multiple options for kids inside the classroom. And I think what you'll see when it comes to disruptive innovation is this is where folks go first. You'll start to see the physical environment outside of the classroom, but in the school being redesigned, because it's not your territory, right? And we know there's a need for it. And so that last piece is that classroom at the high school level. And it's scary. I mean, we didn't go to school like that. We weren't taught like that. I'm not sure kids are going to behave like that, and we're giving up control. So there is no question that there is an inordinate amount of obstacles in front of us like that. But to get to that piece, I think we have to probably start to think about the environment differently. You see vendors right now coming out with different furniture for kids at the high school level as well as the elementary level. It's being designed differently. You're seeing desktop tables with whiteboard spaces on them. You're seeing bean bags, high school kids. I've walked into high school classrooms where you've got bean bags all around and you've got desks. And yeah, I mean, you have to teach kids how to behave in that environment, but it's different. So that's my sense, but I think we're probably a ways away from that. It's a great question. Anybody, does that answer your question, or do you have an additional follow-up on that? Carrie, do you have the mic for him?
Follow-up to that, are class sizes part of that redesign?
Good question.
I mean, I'm not talking next year, and I have no idea what your plan is at Fraser, but 5 years from now, 10 years from now, I would say it differently. I wouldn't say class size. I'd say student to teacher ratio in terms of workload of what number of kids teachers see a day and what that looks like. I'd stop thinking about it in terms of a day. I'd start thinking about it in terms of larger chunks of time. But you physically can't do some of this stuff with our current structures. So yes, I think class size would be on the table with that. But it doesn't necessarily mean that every class is going to go to 15-to-1. It means you're going to rework ratios of when you see kids at different times, is my sense. It's a good question. Yep. Let's use the mic because it's helpful for people to hear.
For the performance tasks, if a kid's choosing what type of task he wants, is it all right to, the whole year long, choose the same style? And the example would be for our genetic engineering thing in cells this year, okay, we gave them questions where they could apply to real life problems and solve the problems of genetic engineering through writing, a lab, and then the other one, I had tremendous drawers this year in our class, so I let them create pictures or murals about their problem and then explain the solution. Those kids drew tremendous murals, I mean, unbelievable, and they had great explanations. Do they do that the entire year, and is that okay? I mean, they were remarkable. They obviously showed proficiency.
Right.
but is that acceptable to choose that same path all year?
What grade?
7th.
7th grade, yeah, I'd say no. And here's why I would say that. They're too early to determine a career on this. They have to have the skill set to write, no matter mostly what career you're going to go into. And at the end of the day, there will be a handful of kids that you see over your career that can be paid to be a professional muralist or artist. And so I think we have to think of it that way. If there is, at the high school level, I'd probably think about that a little bit differently. I still think they have to master the course standards, and you can't just paint your way through that, figuratively and literally. But I will say that at the middle school level, I think it's just too early to determine that. So would I want to see more kids having a contextual approach to learning around the intelligence preferences, and that happens so that there's a love of learning and they get to demonstrate that mastery and feel success? More often, yes, but I do think there's a balance. So I would not let them draw or paint all the way through. And the other piece is they have to be thinking about, can they be paid to do what they're doing? Ultimately, they need to actually have a job and a career, and those becomes important pieces of that. So how you balance their choice and what you're yeah, so what I would do is, in this particular case, this is going through several chapters, so I may alternate. So I may say, you choose this time, I choose next time. You choose this time, I choose next time. And alternate that way. And I would keep a track of, okay, they selected the drawing and they wanted to act out. Next time, they're writing a script. So I think they have to develop that. It's a great question. Yep, over here.
Do you look at this design as being like universal from elementary, middle school to high school?
Yeah.
Oftentimes we're inundated with elementary examples as opposed to high school examples.
Yeah, it's a great question. So being very direct, yes. We lack systemically a high school model. So the question was, do you see this example being K-12? In other words, is this instructional design K-12? And then the follow-up comment was, because we often see elementary examples. And so let me just be really direct on that. Yep, I think it's K-12. I think there's no reason we shouldn't be able to do it. And the reason why we only see elementary examples is because we lack a high school model for this. And it is a systemic problem across our country. And it's a bigger leap for high school teachers and classrooms to go to this model because we're just not used to that, and it's tougher. So I don't think there's any reason why we shouldn't, but I also understand that there will be different issues associated with that, and I think that's a great question in that. I mean, and I don't know here. I mean, I haven't walked around your high school classrooms. It's been probably 2 years. But you can reflect on that right now. I mean, I don't know how your rooms are set up, but I still tend to, when I visit high school classrooms across the country, see a very similar setup. So, not everybody, but it's a similar setup. It's a good question. How am I doing on time? I want to get through.
Okay, you've got about 15 minutes.
Okay, great. Let me keep going. These are great questions. We'll have some more time for these. So let's look at, is it Chris back there? Chris, right? Do I remember your name? Chris jumped ahead of us and started to get into learning styles, which is great. Okay, so learning styles, we talked about Dunn and Dunn and their 1992 definition. It's a preferred contextual approach to learning. So I talked about some of these. We list these in our book, but there are a lot more that we can think of. But here are some. So these pictures are going to be a little bit hard to see up here, but here's an example, right? So when we look at, in this particular case, noisy or quiet. So we give kids opportunities to put on headphones and kind of be lost in their own thoughts, or kids can be collaborating and doing work with others. Sitting down or standing up. So we even see that with adults as well as kids, right? Some of us just need to be standing while we're listening or working on this, or sitting down. So what does the furniture design look like in that space? I've seen a lot of, especially at the high school level, some of the more progressive districts that are trying to move to the redesign of the environment. I've seen the bar top, so there's no chairs associated with it, but the table is bar height, so kids can walk up. You see them in airports now. some of the newer airports that are designing some of their terminals, where you've got the bar height, you can bring your stuff up and you're standing around the bar table with that. So you see that a lot at the high school level, because kids tend to like that at the high school level. One task or multitask. The only way we allow kids to work on multitasks at once is the ability that we've got digital curriculum built. One of the things that you see here is in this picture, it's hard to see here, but you see a group of kids collaborating around a table, and all of them are toggling back and forth between the actual performance task and the actual context clues task 1. So the idea here is not you have to do task 1, then you do task 2, then you do the performance task, because that's the fun thing, which is traditionally get your work done and then you can actually do the fun stuff. What the teacher says in this case is 2 weeks, we need to complete it all. You choose. And what happens is kids are working on the performance task and then they're actually struggling with some of that and they have to go back to the actual core knowledge to learn it, to then do it. And so kids have the choice to work on one task or multitask. Independent or in a group is another one. And then this is moving around or sitting still. And this is a picture of a kid. And when it's hard to see on here, but you can't see him here. He's in the back of the classroom here, and he's sitting on a chair with casters. And he was fidgety and moving around. And when we zoomed in up close on him when we were in the classroom, we saw that he had the opportunity to just be moving around on the chair, but the teacher put him in his own kind of contained space, and it worked for him. And so when you start to walk into a classroom, the environment dictates oftentimes learning styles. And if a teacher is cognizant of this list, I think you can begin to think about your physical space in a different way. And so how can you begin to incorporate these options for kids in your physical space? Part of that, over time, is probably going to be the redesign of furniture. But there are clever ways that classrooms are thinking about this different ways, and part of it's just giving kids permission to, if you need to stand up, stand up. If you want it quieter or noisier, I mean, so some of these lists become, and I'm sure you can probably come up with better examples than we did on this. So learning styles gets at a lot of the environmental work on that. And then finally, the last piece is, in this particular case, we built an extension. So if Jeff looks over here at the extension, and this was specifically to move past the performance task. And so the biggest fear that teachers often have is when you open up curriculum in a digital space, what happens if kids get done and they actually go through it all? And what do you do with them, right? So we've started to build in some extensions on this. And so in this case, they're doing a Google drawing, or they can upload it. And so it gives them examples of this particular extension in this case. So what I want you to do is, we've got a couple of minutes left, turn and talk and process that, and then we're going to finalize with a few more comments and questions, because I think just you processing this and reflecting on this is helpful. Go ahead and turn and talk at your table there. Jeff, can you bring up the hit list? Okay, 3, 2, 1. One of the connections that we wanted to make is if you look at the design of this lesson, I know you all have been working on the series of 25 behaviors that the literature directly ties and correlates to increased student achievement. And when we look at that, we chunk these behaviors. And so one of the first things that jumps out at me is this idea of a ready-to-learn environment, the strategic arrangement of furniture. And you can see here, as we look at some of these behaviors on the high-impact teaching behavior list, how it begins to really resonate with this actual concept of a lesson block. Go ahead and scroll down, Jeff, for me. Keep going down. And keep going, student engagement. Yep, stop there. So what I want to do is I want you to take a look at, for a couple of minutes, tasks or behaviors 20 through 25. Strategic use of analysis, reasoning, and creating, metacognition and self-actualization, the application of real-world relevance in primary sources, strategic use of technology to increase the instructional impact, the appropriate use of technology to manage flexible networks, facilitate anywhere, anytime learning, and leverage digital content, differentiation to facilitate learning based upon 21st century learners and their learner profiles, and the embedded application of 21st century skills. Look at those 20 through 25 behaviors and talk with the person next to you. Where do you see that, if you do it all, playing out in the lesson block here? Can you identify that? Turn and talk now with your neighbor there. Okay, 3, 2. How about any comments or additional burning questions? You've always got great questions. So, yep, we have somebody over here. Carrie, can we?
I see my left side. Dr. Lons isn't moving
Vanna
very
White,
quickly.
Vanna White, the mic over there, please.
He's going to go over there.
Otherwise, it'll be hard for people to hear.
Okay. I'm just wondering, how do you do this with 35 kids switching 90 minutes? The differentiation, because I've got this made into a poster in my classroom.
Okay.
And I have a question that says, for number 24, ask S. Smith how you do this with 400 kids per year.
The only way you can do it is with technology.
Even then.
Yeah, I think as what the problem right now is that it's a laborious build, right? We just have to own the fact that the digital content right now, there's a lot of digital content out there, but unless we design it in its learning as an effective digital lesson, it's really hard to do anything with it. And that's just going to take time. And so if you have digital lessons that are built around your content area, it takes 3 seconds to click which kids get what before they come into the classroom or in the morning, if it's built. And you choose which kids, for 15 minutes that you want to pull and work with. And it's not to say that you want to do this all the time. I mean, you might frame the learning for kids as well with the whole group. So you can begin to differentiate for 300 kids if the digital content's built along kind of the readiness factors. It's just a click. It's a
Sean,
click of a button.
Can I jump in real quick?
Yeah.
I think that's why it's important that we have a plan and we are very thoughtful next year about the building of our units within its learning. And we work together as, you know, the PLCs, the different groups to build that content. Because it's going to be a very time-consuming and laborious task if one person tries to build all of Algebra 1 or all of English 9. We have to work together and be willing to share our resources and really work together to get that work done.
Yeah, I mean, I think the vision is that you have access to a really high-quality digital curriculum, and then you can, over time, customize it and put your tweak on it and your spin on it and make it your own. Right now, you can't, to that degree, differentiate for every kid if you've got 400 kids. So hopefully that should ease the anxiety. What I do think you can do is, you know, build a couple of lessons and try it right now and see how it goes. But the infrastructure isn't in place. That's why you've got a team of administrators thinking, you know, 6 months ago, 12 months ago, they were already wrestling with this question because they knew that we would get to this place where teachers had the skill set to do it, and now you just want the infrastructure. So there's a plan, and it's going to take some time. It's a good question. I think we've got time for one more comment or question.
Anybody else?
Don't be shy.
Oh, okay.
Where is the assessment coming from then?
Yeah, so that's a great question. So the question is assessment, right? So in the platform, you've got to build in both formative checks for understanding to give you data before the kids go into the unit, as well as some more summative pieces of how do they do at the end of the unit, right? Because the only way they should be able to move through is based on competency and their mastery of learning this. So there has to be an assessment plan tied to the building of curriculum. And I know Carrie and some of the other folks are thinking about those components. I don't know if you want to add some of that.
No, that's a great question too, and I think we need to be a part of the assessment conversation. So as you're developing your competencies, we're developing those assessments right alongside with that work. So that's going to come out of the work that we're doing with building our competencies. So great question. Other questions? Comments? All right.
Are we close to time?
We're
Can I
close
let
to
them go?
time,
Can
yeah.
I let them go a minute or
Got
two early?
one more
Excellent.
minute.
Thank you. Well, that's perfect timing then. I always appreciate coming and both learning from you and hearing where you are in the work, and I applaud the fact that you are just embarking on this journey, because I've said this time and time again, I deeply believe in this work. I think it's the work that we have to do to continue to have relevant a public education system that can serve kids in the conceptual age, and I think this is part of that journey. So I thank you. I appreciate the work you're doing, and I know I probably won't see you before school is out, so have a restful and relaxing, I know that you're not quite there yet, but summer, and take the time off and enjoy it. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Sean.
One task or multitask. This was interesting. When we visited this classroom, we saw kids working over here, and we saw kids toggling back and forth in their system between their performance task and task 1 or task 2 and where they were working on. And they may have spent 10 minutes working on the performance task and then toggling back and over and working on the context clues and doing a series of exercises within that. Kids own the choice on that and looking at the navigation of one task or multitask. Independent or in a group, so giving kids options on here. And then moving around or sitting still. This was an interesting picture here. This is the whole class picture. I'll send this PowerPoint out to you guys so you can see this picture. But there's a kid in the back here working by himself, so he's independent. And when we zoomed in on it, he was on a chair on casters, and he was just fidgety. And he was moving around the classroom and doing his thing, but he was in this controlled space in the back, working by himself, and he had the ability to just fidget and move around. And you see this all the time. What I think is interesting is we don't always see this at the middle and high school level. And I know there are middle school teachers in here, and I think some of your classrooms may look like this, but not every classroom. And I've visited a lot of classrooms across this country, especially at the high school level. And so how do you think systemically about this preferred contextual brain approach to learning and giving kids options within this in your lessons. And so I think that's another piece of building lessons around this. So that becomes critical. And then finally, this idea of, in this 2-week period, is our biggest fear is kids get through everything. And so what happens if they get through everything too fast and you've got 3 days left, right? Which scares everybody. You're like, what am I going to do with Johnny? So we built an extension task. And so if you look over here, we've got an extension task built into this. And in this particular case, there's an extension based on the novel, and kids are going to create something around their context clues and an integration of a Google app in this particular case. And so in this scenario, the curricula was opened up for kids, and kids had choices on this. Now, if we redesigned this and we looked at first grade, you couldn't open up curriculum for 2 weeks for first graders. That's not going to happen. But I do think we could extend the pacing options for kids if this was built in here, and when Johnny completed a certain thing around a fluency test, that we can move him on if that's built. I think you can control more of that. One of the things that you see, if you scroll up, is in a lot of platforms, they have the ability to freeze the class or actually open it up in terms of kids' digital devices. And so you're seeing more navigation tools that teachers can use in the digital space with that. So I want to give you a few minutes to just kind of turn and talk again. And then the last thing is, Jeff, I'm going to bring up the HIT 25, which are the high-impact teaching behaviors. And I want you to kind of think about, as we close today, how the high-impact teaching behaviors are played out in this. So go ahead and turn and talk for a few minutes, react to this, and then we're going to come back together. Okay, 3, 2, 1. Take a look here. Many of you have been working through at your schools, and I know your principals have been, some of your principals have been coaching you through some of these things, but take a look at the, this comes from chapter 9 of Teacher as Architect, which are the 25 behaviors in the literature that the literature says teacher behaviors directly correlate to student academic performance and achievement. And so let's take a look at 20 through 25. Strategic use of analysis, reasoning, and creating. Strategic use of metacognition and self-actualization tasks. Application of real-world tasks or relevance and primary sources. Strategic use of technology to increase the instructional impact. The appropriate use of technology to manage flexible networks, facilitate anywhere, anytime learning, and leverage digital content. Differentiation to facilitate learning based on 21st century learners and their learner profiles. And embedded application of 21st century skills. Of those 6 behaviors, reflect on this component here of this 2-week lesson block. Which behaviors can you find in some of the stuff that I've walked you through today? Talk to your neighbor about that now. What can you identify from the HIT 25 list? Okay, go ahead and finish your thoughts. 4, 3, great. How about any questions or additional comments to kind of close us out? And then I know Carrie's going to chat with you. I think, as you're reflecting on this, I think you're doing a lot of this work already.
I second that.
I hope it's validating in some respects. And in the other piece, I hope that it's pushed your thinking a little bit more, because that was what it was designed to do. The other piece is, and I really believe we need to do this, but it gives us a common professional language in our profession. And I think we need to label what we do as educators, because it helps us communicate and collaborate about this work, and we need the professional language to be able to, I think, talk about that. And so this begins to paint that picture. Any questions or kind of closing comments that might be helpful for the group? Going once? It's the end of the day.
It is the end of the day. And it's May.
And it's May.
I know, it's May. It's May in the school. Well, I just wanted to add, I always love when Sean comes to Fraser because you give us a bigger perspective, and I think that's important, is to hear the bigger perspective, but it also validates the work that we're doing. And I hope you saw today that we are doing so many of these things that we've seen today, and you're doing this work each and every day in your classroom, and I commend each and every one of you for that. And just, stay the course. We're doing great work. And we're very proud of the work that each and every one of you do each day. And I want to just thank Sean for being here and helping us on this journey.
And remember, it's a journey. It's not going to be built in a day. Thank you. Have a great rest of the afternoon, and I probably won't see you before you end for the end of the school year. So good luck on the rest of your school year, and hopefully take some lots of time to rest and relax over the summer. It's almost here. Thank you.